warm welcome to our special broadcast. We are tracking the Union budget, the last, in fact, full budget that the Government of India is going to present before the upcoming elections. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. The Finance Minister of India, Mr. Arun Jaitley, is all set to present the budget for financial year 2018-19 in a few hours from now. And this year's budget holds unique significance as it is the penultimate budget of the incumbent government ahead of the general election that could take place later this year or definitely next year. And this is the first after the GST was implemented. Expectations run high among public and investors as the Finance Minister is set to outline the government's priorities for the next fiscal. This year, the government is likely to offer incentives to the farming sector and small businesses. Many analysts expect new measures to be announced to improve the farm sector's productivity and income. The budget could also give a big boost to the infrastructure sector, which will help create jobs and accelerate economic growth. Mr. Jaitley had earlier hinted that the budget may have some relief for taxpayers. People are eagerly waiting for the government to raise the income tax limit. For industries, the government is expected to reduce corporate tax rate and cut minimum alternative tax to 15%. The government faces the dilemma of balancing growth and inflation amid rising prices of oil, which can lead to higher inflation. Rebooting reforms and pushing exports are among the major challenges that the Modi-led government needs to deal with in this budget. So many expectations, multiple challenges, myriad possibilities. India's finance minister has his work cut out when he announces the budget today. But with general elections slated for next year, will politics trump economics is the big question. Take a look at this.
It's the last full budget of the Modi government. Opportunities abound, and so are the challenges. Can Finance Minister Arun Jaitley make everyone happy? Well, that's definitely not an easy task when it's about a country as diverse as India. What more, India is on course to become the world's fifth largest economy, beating former colonizer the United Kingdom. So the world is watching. Let's begin with the foreign investors. What they desire is fiscal consolidation. India's GDP deficit target is about 3.2%. What that means is that the government spends 103.2 rupees for every 100 rupees it earns. And that dents investor confidence. But then elections are next year, and good economics doesn't make for good politics. So the finance minister will definitely have to get his decisions right for him to be able to present the budget for the next 5 years. China has been giving India border pains, so defence outlay will be a major decision for the government. Now India spends around 2.5% of GDP on defence. There's certainly scope for improvement there. Health and education will be the other priorities for the government. But agriculture is important too, especially in a budget before the election year. The government has no choice but to keep farmers happy. And then there's the ever-growing youth population. Give them jobs and retain power, else the youth get restless. The finance minister's task is cut out. WION will have national and international experts breaking down India Budget 2018 for you. Bureau Report, WION.
Makes this budget special. One of the first reasons is that this is going to be the Modi government's last full budget as the general elections are scheduled for early next year. And the government presents the vote on account before elections, which enables it to fund its expenses for a short period of time or until a full budget is passed. The Constitution of India mandates that there is parliamentary approval to draw money from the Consolidated Fund of India, which generally takes some time. So the vote on account, which usually lasts a period of 2 months, is required to approve spending for a short term, which is why we are calling it the last full budget. This is also the second time that the budget will be presented in February. Until 2016, the budget was presented on the last working day of February. But last year, the government advanced the budget for the first working day of the month. Joining us this morning is a very special panel. Dr. Rajiv Kumar, Vice Chairman of the Niti Aayog, who understands what sort of planning is going on in the government. Sadanand Dhume, Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Vinod Jain, who's a Chartered Accountant and a tax expert, will be with me in the Noida studio. Jasper Reed, Investment Expert, with me. And Renu Kohli, who's an economist. Richard M. Rosso, Senior Advisor and the Wadhwani Chair in the India-US Policy Studies. And we will be joined by Vivek Law, who's with Zee Business, also the editor-in-chief of the Money Mile from Noida. Jasper, let's begin with you, and good morning to you.
Good morning, Palki.
Among the various other things that I outlined just now, the big challenge for this government is to balance populism and fiscal prudence. And how do you see the finance minister go about it?
Well, I agree with that, Palki. I think populism versus fiscal prudence is entirely in the context of the electoral cycle. So depending on where you peg the national election, whether that's in a year's time, 18 months' time, possibly even earlier, that defines, I think, the messages that will come out of Arun Jaitley's statement today. So I think the leading item before you even get into those is what's the political agenda?
What is the political agenda? Sadanand Dhume, what are your expectations from the budget, especially when it comes to job creation?
No, I think this is, possibly the single most important challenge that the government faces. When the Prime Minister was elected in 2014, he had two principal promises, in my view. One was to end corruption and the other was to provide jobs. And I think, in a way, one has been the victim of the other. The focus, in a way, on things like demonetization, doubling down on tax terrorism by over-empowering tax inspectors and so on, I think that has contributed to putting a damper on domestic investment spirits, in addition, of course, to the twin balance sheet problem. And so we are heading to 2019 with jobs really not having been created. And the number that everyone ought to remember is that India needs to create 1 million new jobs a month. That's the number of new people entering the labor force. And I don't think anyone realistically believes that even a fraction of those jobs are being created. So this is a real problem. I would completely agree with the points that Naina Lal Kidwai raised, that what you really need to look for is labor-intensive industries.
And my colleague Raghavendra Rao is also joining us this morning. Raghavendra, they have to balance politics with economics. What are you picking up?
Indeed, Palki, and it's going to be Arun Jaitley will have to maintain a very fine balance when he rises to present what is effectively the last budget of the Modi government. The next budget, of course, being an interim budget, as we know. And what Mr. Jaitley would be trying to do is to balance economics with politics, as you rightly said. The fact that the government is keeping an eye on the upcoming Lok Sabha elections in 2019. They would want to present a budget which is forward-looking, which gives people hope, which makes people believe that the government indeed has a long-term plan for them. And also the fact that in doing so, they will have to consider the kind of reserves and the kind of finances they have in their kitty. So it is going to be a very tightrope walk, so to say. And the challenge here, again, as the issues we have been discussing over the past few days, issues like job creation and the distress in the agricultural sector, those are the main issues which the government would be very, very keen to address. The country has been witnessing assembly elections every now and then, and the last assembly elections we witnessed, particularly one that of Gujarat, that was an election that threw up the issues of agriculture distress and job creation, and now these two issues are top of the agenda as far as the Modi government is concerned. It remains to be seen whether Finance Minister Arun Jaitley goes the populist way, goes the populist lane in trying to dole out SOPs, as has normally been the case with previous governments. Whenever they have to present the last effective budget of their tenures, we have often seen populism taking center stage. But that remains to be seen whether Mr. Jaitley actually does that. But he indeed has a very tough job at his hands, because the kind of financial and economic situation he's dealing with, to balance it out with politics will surely be a challenge.
Vivek, would you say this is the toughest budget that Finance Minister Arun Jaitley is presenting in this government?
Absolutely. I think it's a very critical budget. He's got his hands tied. On the one hand, you've got this is going to be sounding the 2019 bugle. This election speech, this budget speech is going to be more like an election speech. On the other hand, he doesn't have the money. He is expecting GST collections, income tax collections to go up post demonetization for this next financial year. He's got the sword of the fiscal deficit on his head. There are calls that doesn't matter, breach it, it's okay, you've got to go and spend, you've got to go and spend. But he understands that the ramifications of that, we've just celebrated this rating upgrade. That's not going to be taken kindly if you go and breach that. At the same time, he has to spend on agriculture. We've seen the recent elections, what they've thrown up. So yes, it is the toughest budget. From the common man's point of view, if you see, they are expecting tax breaks. I don't know how much leeway he has. And of course, the markets are really spooked about the fact that there could be a long-term capital gains tax. My sense is, even if it does come, he'll have to do it for the rich. But you've seen crores of Indians who've come and actually started investing in equities, and I think they're very worried that are you going to go back to the regime where you say that you're going to be taxed on your gains. But having said that, I think, yes, you're right. It is going to be his toughest budget.
Indeed. And would you say that the Prime Minister, to a certain extent, managed expectations when he said analysts who say this?
Well, it's good of him to say that, but I think this is the final budget, and you're going to have only a vote of account, in 2019. In 2019, yes, next year. He has to do a lot more to kickstart the investment cycle. Let's understand, growth is just about coming back. We've had a slump following the demonetization, following GST. Agriculture, farmer distress, that's something that he cannot just ignore. The middle class, he has to be able to give them some sops in this budget. So I think it's okay to say that, it's not going to be a populist budget. But he also realizes this is his last shot at being able to give some dole out to people.
Jasper, your expectations?
I think I largely agree with Vivek in the sense that the conundrum here is sort of how to please people when the piggy bank is less than full. It's a bit like me at college trying to impress the girls but having absolutely no money. It's a similar thing. Look, I think here, as I said before, it's all about politics and it's all about the timing of the next election. On that front, and Mr. Modi has the best possible kind of personal barometer of popularity. Post Gujarat, when I think they had a shock, I think they'll be looking now to kind of steady the ship a little bit. The problem, of course, they have is there's absolutely nothing they can do that's going to have an impact pre-election. And so what I would be saying, Palki, is, if I was in Mr. Jaitley's shoes, is sort of neutrality. Neutrality is probably neither good nor bad, is where I'd be looking to end up from a message perspective.
Renu Kohli, India has one of Asia's largest budget deficits. And given what both the other panelists have said, after Gujarat, we've seen how the rural economy is looking for more attention from the government. How do you see them balancing it?
Well, I agree with my co-panelists that it's a difficult call. It's a kind of a balancing act. I do think that given the political backdrop, and the budget or fiscal policy is always more an exercise in political economy than just pure economics, I think given the political backdrop, the budget has to be, or the finance minister and the government has to be seen to be visibly and perceptibly responding to the demands of the rural sector, where there has been a significant amount of stress in terms of prices not collapsing and so on. At the same time, there are constraints, and given the rise in interest rates for more than since August last year, that is the pressure. So the question is how they are going to do it. Well, the reports that have been coming out in the past few days is that it seems that the line ministries will be asked increasingly to manage their resources from their monetization of their assets, and therefore that is likely to release some bit of fiscal space to respond to the rural situation, and particularly to the farmers group. I do think that the government is quite likely to be mindful of the fact that it has to adhere to a certain fiscal discipline, which is largely expected by the markets. I do also think that they may not take that risk of deviating too substantially from what the budgeted targets are, or from the fiscal deviation path, fiscal consolidation path which has been planned.
Richard Russo, it's a tough balancing act. How do you see this government doing it?
Well, you know, I think that if you look at the broad sweep of what's happened since the Modi government came into office 3.5 years ago, a lot of reforms, I think, relatively quickly out of the gate. You saw kind of a revamp of the regulations on coal and oil and gas. GST took a little bit longer, but most of the big reforms they did were pretty early on. So I think, you know, overall, if you're trying to judge what a government should do in a 5-year term, reform early, especially those reforms that there's going to be some short-term pain and dislocation, and then spend the rest of the time focusing on implementation of service delivery. So now you're seeing things like cooking gas cylinders, electrification, things like that become a lot more prevalent in what the government is kind of messaging and talking about than it was before. So, you know, by and large, I think I agree with what the other panelists have said. I just have two pieces that I'd like to add to that, which is really taking a look, I think, largely from the foreign investor and foreign trader perspective. Number one is, you know, they're hoping the budget does no harm. One of the ways that the Modi government has tried to stimulate local manufacturing is by putting up some barriers. Some of those were existing, of course, before the Modi government came in. But if you look at solar panels and electronics, capital goods, areas like that, they've put up barriers. So the question is, are you going to see the introduction of new customs duties on some of the areas that American firms trade heavily with India? So we don't want to see that. We don't want to see a go back to things like retrospective taxation, or even some broad brush things from budgets past, digging back in the memory banks about 10 years, something like the fringe benefit tax that, while, you know, reasonable on its face, I think sent the markets for a shudder. So do no harm is one thing I'd add. The other is the finance minister's budget speech. I think it gets a little bit less attention, you know, than it did 10 or 15 years ago. But right now, I think the foreign investor community is kind of looking for those one or two nodal reforms that are kind of out there on the horizon. I think early on, the government was talking about GST and bankruptcy bill. I think a lot of executives around the world right now are looking for what's that next signal reform that's going to indicate, you know, continued progress, even if it's something that won't happen in the budget, even if it's something that won't happen in the next year. There is no one or two single reforms, I think, that people have in mind. So hopefully the finance minister can kind of refill that basket of what to look for in big reforms in the speech.